Hey y'all, it's me, Serena. Well, this is definitely going to be a different kind of video today. In one of my previous videos, I asked if y'all would be interested in hearing this story, and the response was a resounding yes. So I had to kind of mentally gear myself up to tell it. Not that it's anything traumatic to me, necessarily, but I just had to get all my thoughts together. So here's a story about the serial killer that I grew up next to. So some background, I grew up in a very rural area of Tennessee. I grew up in a very small town on the Cumberland Plateau, kind of in between Nashville and Chattanooga, closer to Chattanooga. But like I said, very rural, and the town that I lived in had less than 1,000 people, or maybe 1,000. So everybody knows everybody. And especially in my family, because my mother was a school teacher. She taught for 30 years in the elementary school there. So for a 30-year time span, she taught every child at some point. But anyway, we lived kind of on the outskirts, not on the outskirts, but just inside the town limits on a 2-lane highway. And it is a state highway, but I use the term kind of loosely because it didn't get a lot of traffic. It was a 2-lane highway. And we were kind of the first house you got to as you came into town. And then about a quarter or a third of a mile up the road from us was, a lot more houses on your way into town. There was, in one of those houses up the street or up the road, a boy named John Chapman. And of course, he went to school with me. He was in my mother's 3rd grade class the year he went through. He was about 3 years older, 3 or 4 years older than me. And so yeah, he had a sister that was younger than him. She was a year ahead of me in school. So of course we knew them from school and from living up the road. A little more background, where our house was, you couldn't see any houses from our house. We lived on a 4 or 5 acre parcel of land that had been part of a much bigger piece of property that belonged to my grandfather. He owned a lot of land, and when my mom and my stepdad got married, he carved out this tract and gave it to my mom for her and my stepdad Ralph to build a house on. So behind our house, and our house was built in 1979-80, that one was, but directly behind our house, as the crow flies, was a small lake, big pond. It was on my grandfather's property. And years prior, he had this pond dug and had it stocked with fish, just for people to come and fish and whatever. And after all these years, it still has fish in it. And people went back there to fish, and we didn't care. People picked up after themselves and never had any problem with people loitering back there or anything like that. But to get to that lake or pond, you had to walk down part of our driveway, and then our driveway kind of curved around and made a circular drive next to our house. But if you kept walking straight back after the curved part of our driveway, it became just a little path, like a gravel dirt path, and it went straight back, and then it curved back behind our house and took you back to that pond. So it was common occurrence for people in the summertime or in nice weather to come walk down through there, going back to Malcolm's pond to fish. Malcolm being my grandfather, that's what everybody called it. And so that's just the way it was, no big deal. But John Chapman, who lived up the road, when he got to be a teenager, whatever, he would come back there a lot during the summertime. And so it was just not an uncommon thing at all for him to be coming out there and walking down, going back and fishing. Years go by, and my sister is in college, and she comes home from her freshman year of college, and she catches the attention of John Chapman. And my sister is beautiful. She is now and she was then. She's got gorgeous red hair. She's a natural redhead, and it's like this kind of deep auburny red, just really pretty. And he started leaving her notes. He would leave notes on her car, and I know one time he left a flower either on her car or in the seat of her car or something. And that summer, when she was home from college, she worked over in town at the grocery store that our uncle, well, he was our great uncle, he owned the grocery store in town, and she worked over there that summer. And John Chapman started hanging around the store, and I guess kind of making her feel uncomfortable, but he was younger than her because she's 8 years older than me. So she would have been like 19 at the time. So he would have been maybe 15, something like that. And anyway, she let him know that, thanks, I'm flattered, but, I'm not interested. Just simple as that. And after that, he kind of backed off with the notes and all the stuff. So, but he still came back there to fish and whatever. And remember the part about my sister having the pretty red hair, because that will come up later in the story. So fast forward a few years and I'm in high school. And it's the 80s, and of course in the summer I am working on my tan. Bad, I know, but we were dumb back then and young, and we all did it. And so at our house we had a big deck that wrapped around the back of the house, and it faced the woods. Nobody could see me from the highway. So I would lay out there in my little bikini and had my boom box out there listening to Duran Duran or whatever. And so I laid out there a lot whenever the weather got nice, working on my tan. And, sometimes while I was out there, I would see people walking by, going back to the pond to fish. And sometimes I saw John Chapman walking back there. No big deal. He did it all the time. So one day I was out there laying out, and my mother opened the door and came out there, and she says, "Serena, get in the house right now." And I was like, why? I was working on my tan. Why you want me to come in? And so anyway, I went in the house. I thought I was in trouble or something. I was like, oh no. So I went in, and she said, "I don't want you laying out there anymore." She said, "because John Chapman is back there in the woods watching you." And I was like, okay, creepy, but I really didn't think anything of it because I was a teenager and I was more interested in laying out and working on my tan, and I was irritated that I wasn't going to be able to do that anymore. But my mother had been in the kitchen, where she always was, and her kitchen sink had the window over it, and it looked out into the backyard. And apparently she had been observing him, and he was back there kind of in the woods on the way back there to the pond, and she had seen him just hanging out back there. He wasn't going to fish, he was hanging out back there and was watching me sunbathe. So that's kind of gross. So I didn't get to lay out on the deck anymore after that. So fast forward a few years, my sister's married and whatever, and I'm in college. This was 1990. A young lady was abducted from a gas station convenience store where she worked, and her body was found in a cemetery not far from, where we lived. And I'm not going to go into all the details of this because there are some links that I'm going to put in the description box down below where you can go read more details about the case and things like that. But she was working one evening at this gas station, and her husband came to bring her dinner like he always did when she was working in the evenings, and she wasn't there. And upon further investigation, they saw her glasses in the parking lot on the ground. And so they knew something was up because nothing had been stolen from the store. The money was all there, but she was gone. So she was found the next day just by someone passing by the cemetery and saw what they thought was a body, and it ended up being a body, and it was her. And she was in her early 20s, and she had been sexually assaulted and strangled and stabbed. So this was 1990. DNA evidence wasn't really a thing, but they did the whole, collecting the evidence and kept it and all that. So a vehicle matching the description of John Chapman's truck was seen the evening that she disappeared at the gas station. But this wasn't anything really out of the ordinary because, other people were there too. And he worked in that area and he was a regular customer, and it wasn't unusual for him to stop in there when he got off work to get something, on his way home. So anyway, he was there, but, so were other people. So that case went unsolved for a while. And 2 years later, this in 1992, I remember this very vividly because I had just graduated college. I was working at my first job. I was working over in Chattanooga. And this was all over the news that summer because it was just so unusual because it happened in a small town. And anyway, at an interstate rest area in Monteagle, close to where I grew up, same county, different town. I-24 went through there, and on top of the mountain there at Monteagle, there was an interstate rest stop. Well, a woman's body was found, not very far, but in the woods behind the rest area building. And she was a lady from Chicago. She had been on her way to Atlanta for a conference, and she never showed up. And I forget how, I don't remember if someone just stumbled upon her body in the woods or if her car was located there after she had been reported missing and then they searched and found her. I don't remember those details, but she was in the woods. But it was the summertime in the South. Her body had been back there for a few days, kind of decomposing in the heat and with the critters, use your imagination. But she had also been sexually assaulted and strangled. That was in June. So the attendants who were on duty at the rest areas, the eastbound and the westbound, they were both interviewed. And the attendant working at the eastbound rest stop where this lady was found in the woods happened to be John Chapman. So I think he was questioned, but there was nothing necessarily to tie him to her disappearance or whatever. There's no cameras there. So he was questioned and released. Well, fast forward a few months after that. This is November of 92. And another woman stops at that same rest stop. She was from Nashville. And she stopped in there, and the attendant working at the rest stop was John Chapman. And I guess on her way, she probably went in to use the restroom, and then on her way out or whatever, he tried to grab her. And she got away from him. And she got in her car, and she went up to the next exit and got off and went into a gas station or whatever, because this was before cell phones, and called the police and said, hey, this guy working down at the rest area just tried to grab me. And so at that point, they, police went down there, and who was working at the rest area that day but John Chapman? So he was brought in for questioning. So the police questioning him, then remembered, okay, we had this guy has tried to grab this woman. She has identified him. A few months ago, we had a woman's body found behind the rest stop, and he was working on duty that day. So, DNA was starting to be a thing now in 1992. So, they asked him to submit DNA, and he did. And he was a match to the woman's body that was found behind the rest stop. And this had been turned over to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and the officer working on the case happened to remember, oh yeah, we've got an unsolved murder, similar circumstances, from 2 years ago. So they ran his DNA against the DNA that was collected from that girl, the one who was working at the gas station. And wouldn't you know, it was a match. So he was convicted for, kidnapping, rape, whatever, murder of 2 women. And then the third woman, thank God, got away and was able to identify him. And, she was on her way to being his third victim, but she managed to get away. And so this is the same guy who grew up right down the road from me. So remember earlier in the story, I mentioned that my sister had or has red hair. Well, the first victim of John Chapman's, her name was Michelle Blake. She was the young lady who worked at the gas station that he abducted and murdered. She also had red hair. And the lady that was found in the woods behind the rest stop off the interstate had red hair. I can't remember if the third lady, the one that got away from him, I honestly can't remember if she had red hair too. But I don't know if he's maintained his innocence through all of this. So he's never admitted to anything, but the evidence was irrefutable against him. And so he's spending, life in prison. I know he's appealed his case a few times, but he's still there. And my theory, for what it's worth, my theory is that, he had this crush on my sister when he was a teenager, and she, shut him down. She wasn't interested in him, and that either made him want to seek out revenge against women, or maybe specifically women with red hair, because the 2 victims that we know he killed, I don't guess there are any others, but there could be, both had red hair. So that is the creepy factor to this story. And it affects her more so than me, but I'm the one with the YouTube channel, so I'm the one telling the story. So that is the story of the serial killer that we grew up down the road from. And unfortunately, there was a lot of crime in our area when I was growing up. People think, small town, rural area, living on a big piece of property, that you would be insulated from crime. And that's a lot of people's dream, and people who don't like big cities, or there's people who, are scared of big cities. They don't want all those people around them. They want to be out to themselves and, buffered from all that. I'm the opposite. I grew up, in a house where you could not see any other house or living person anywhere around. And some really bad things happened in my town and to my family while I was growing up. So I have never wanted to live in an isolated area. I like having people around me. I like living in a neighborhood where I have neighbors. I don't like being alone. I'll tell you some other things that happened to me and my family just while I was growing up. Um, well, that house that I lived in, um, it was burglarized. It's been burglarized 3 times. The first 2 times were shortly after we moved in. I remember my mother and I were coming home from school because she taught school. I was in elementary school, so I rode with her. We came home one day and pulled into the driveway, and she could see that one of the windows into the kitchen had been busted out. And so she didn't know, somebody there, what's going on. So we didn't get out of the car. We turned around and went down to my grandparents' house and called the sheriff's department from there. And the sheriff's department came to our house, and yes, it had been burglarized. They had stolen a bunch of stuff, a bunch of guns that my stepdad had, jewelry of my mother's. I remember this. I had a little cigar box that I kept under my bed, and I saved money in it, like coins and just dollar bills and whatever, because I would have been either in the 4th or 5th grade. So I just kept little keepsake things in this box and money. And even that was gone. They even got my little cigar box that had, it couldn't have had $10 or $20 in it, and that was gone. So that happened. And then about a year after that, almost not to the day, but I think it was in the same month, the house was broken into again. And that time, I guess there wasn't as much to take because all the guns were gone. We had some electronics that they took, but, there was no money in the house. There was no jewelry to speak of or anything like that. But they trashed our house. They just went on a rampage and trashed everything. They had ransacked the place looking for valuable stuff. So the beds were all torn apart, all the drawers and the dressers had been pulled out, the contents dumped out, and it was just an absolute mess. And I remember my mother being really, it was upsetting to me, but still I was a kid. But I remember my mother being really upset that time. And after that, we got a security system. And it didn't happen again. But years after that, I was grown and living in Nashville. My stepdad had a detached garage there on the property because he was an engineer and he had lots of tools and he loved to tinker. He loved to tinker with motors. He worked on everything himself, but he had every tool known to man and had it out there, and he had a really nice detached garage. And so he had a Jeep too that he kept parked in that garage. And one day they had gone out on Sunday afternoon after church for their little Sunday afternoon excursion. And they did this every Sunday. They were very predictable people. And they came back from their little Sunday drive one day, and the garage was burnt to the ground, and his Jeep was gone, and quite a few of his other big ticket item tools. He had some expensive things and they were all gone. So that happened. And I remember one time when I was small because we were still living with my grandparents. We lived with them after my parents divorced up until the time that my mom married Ralph. We lived with my grandparents, and they lived closer into town. But now their house, it was closer into town, but you had to really be wanting to go to their house to get there. It wasn't like right, their driveway wasn't right off the main road like ours was, nothing like that. Well, one night, somebody knocked on the door, and that was unusual. Nobody came to your house there unless you knew they were coming. And it's not a house that you would just be driving by and be like, oh, I ran out of gas or whatever, let me go knock on this door. It wasn't like that. So these 2 guys came and knocked on the door, and my grandmother didn't want to answer it. So my aunt and uncle happened to be in town visiting. So my uncle went to and I was there. My uncle went to the door, and these two guys were saying, "Hey, our car's broke down. We need to call somebody to come get us. Can we come in and use your phone?" So my uncle said, "No, give me a phone number of somebody and I'll go call them for you." And these guys were just really, really persistent. And I remember, my mother telling me to get away, but me being nosy, I've always been nosy. I was around the corner, and I was peeking around the door frame, looking and listening. And these guys were they wouldn't leave. And they were really persistent, and they kept saying, "No, we need to come. We need to talk. Well, we need to talk to him. He won't know who you are. We need to talk to him so he knows it's really us," and all this stuff. So they couldn't get him to leave. And finally, my grandfather goes and gets one of his guns. And he comes to the door and basically tells them, "I've got my gun and I'm not afraid to use it, so y'all need to go on and get out of here." And they did. So who knows what they were up to, but clearly, they lived close enough to town, they could have walked into town. They didn't need to stop at my grandparents' house and use a phone. So they were no doubt up to something. And one night, I remember it was in the summertime, my grandmother had gone outside for something. I don't remember what, but she went out and then she came back running in the house screaming because she had seen somebody outside the house peeking in the bathroom, one of the bathroom windows. Of course, whoever he was, when he saw her, he took off running. It was dark. She didn't see who he was, but that was scary and creepy. And they lived on a pretty big piece of property too. It wasn't like a neighborhood where you got house. Now, they did have neighbors that they could see from their house, unlike us, but it's not like you're just walking down the street, "No, I'm going to peek in this window." You had to be wanting to go to their house to do this. But the absolute worst thing that happened when I was growing up, and this was a huge tragedy for our family, especially for my cousins, and the whole town. This was just horrible. Do you remember me talking about the summer that my sister was working at our great uncle's grocery store? Well, one summer, I think it was 1983, he was murdered in his own home. These guys had been waiting at his house for him to come home. I guess they thought that he brought all the money home from the store, which he didn't. The bank was across the street. It went to the bank. But his wife got home first, and they jumped her, made her open the door to let him in the house. They bound and gagged her, tied her up, and then they lay in wait for my uncle to come home. So he came home with his son, who also worked at the store with him, and when they went in, I don't know what happened, what spooked them, why they started shooting, but they started shooting, and my cousin got shot in the arm. He ended up being okay, but he was shot in the arm, and then my uncle was shot and killed right there in his house. So I won't go into any more details about it, but those guys are serving life in prison as well. They were convicted of first-degree murder, and but that was a huge loss for our family and our community, because he was, a pillar of the community, and everybody loved him. So that was another tragedy that happened in our very small town, and that is why, people talk about being scared of big cities and not wanting to live in a big city and all this stuff. Not me. Cities don't bother me that much. I don't want to live in a rural area because of what I grew up with. And it's just creepy to me. The thought of being in a house where I can't see another soul is terrifying to me. and I don't ever want to live anywhere like that. So that is my story about the serial killer, plus some other anecdotal crime stories from my small town growing up. I will put some links in the description box down below. I wasn't able to find much about John Chapman because all of this happened back before the internet, but I did find some. So I will put some links down there. And the town where I grew up was Altamont, Tennessee. Tiny little town. So if you want to look that up, you can. But that is it for today's story time. And I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions about anything, just leave them down in the comments. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye-bye.